Okay, this is the first of two segments for Wednesday's class. We'll pick up with the Korean War as part of the Cold War in the 1950s. And we'll start out with the idea that the Korean War takes place between 50 and 53, and it actually ends up in an armistice or a ceasefire that still exists today. Now the question is, why are American troops being sent to Asia in the post-World War II era to fight in a place like Korea? Well, if we go back to our larger map and see where Korea is located, you'll see it is located here along the northern area of what is today China. Once China fell to communism, as the Republicans described it, then Korea began to be absorbed by the communists as well. And it was at that point that Truman said, we must stop this, or at least stop the aggression that was involved here. The American interest there was not something that was specifically based on economics, but it was based on stopping the spread of communism. So let's get to how this war actually begins and why the Americans get involved specifically. When World War II ended, the northern portion of Korea was originally controlled by the Japanese during the war, but the surrender for the northern portion of Korea was taken by the Chinese forces that, remember, as we discussed before, were originally Democrats, or at least considered to be a democracy. And then the southern portion of Korea's surrender by the Japanese was taken by the British. As a result of the situation at the end of World War II, the southern half of Korea turned into what we called a democracy, a republic, and the northern half of Korea, which was originally thought to be something that would also become a form of democracy, became communist once China turned communist after the victory of Mao Zedong in the Chinese Civil War. So North Korea, the regime that still exists today, by the way, became communist in 1949. And beginning in 1950, communist troops rolled across the border into the democracy that we saw as South Korea and began to try and take it over and install communism. Now, unlike the Chinese situation, the United States will actually send troops into this scenario. So, Truman, and you could make the argument again that because he's a Democrat, and Democrats were always accused of being weak on communism, that he could not allow South Korea to, quote, fall under the control of communism as well. Truman gets the United Nations to support what is called a police action by Truman, or what we'll describe as a limited war, and we're going to get into that term a little bit later. But it was an attempt to stop the communist aggression under the ideas that had been learned from World War II about stopping Hitler. And he managed to get the United States to vote yes to send troops to try and stop the aggression by the North Koreans into South Korea. Now, he did this even though the Soviet Union was on the Security Council, because the Soviets were boycotting the UN at that point in time because the United Nations had yet to recognize Mao's regime as legitimate Chinese government. In other words, they were not recognizing China as being controlled by the communists yet. So because both USSR and China were not involved in the UN at that point, the United States was able to get the members at the time to vote yes to send troops to South Korea to try and stop this, as it was described, communist aggression. The majority of the troops, of course, will be American troops throughout the war, which was not unusual during this time. But we'll quickly now look at the three phases of the war in Korea. The first phase, which began as North Korean troops rolled across into South Korea, was very successful for the communists as they pushed the Allied forces, South Korea and the Americans, when they do show up, into this small corner here that's called the Pusan Perimeter. And in fact, there was a point where it looked as though American forces would just be taken away and that South Korea would fall to communism. A couple of things to keep in mind about this. Initially, there weren't many American troops that were in South Korea. In fact, many of them who are thrown into this battle are really just picked up from Japan, where they were on occupation duty, and were told that they would be going to Korea, which most of them didn't even know the location of, and were thrown into battle against Russian tanks that were being used by the communists. And because the American troops were once again unprepared, again America's first battles, the American forces and their South Korean allies were pushed southward to the Pusan perimeter. Now, it was at that point that General MacArthur was placed in command of the UN forces, and he actually came up with a rather brilliant strategy, and that leads us to the second part, or second phase of the war, and that is American forces will land behind the communists. The communists are hitting on this, or attacking this area you see here, the Pusan perimeter. American forces, because of their sea superiority, will land here at a place called Incheon and begin to move across to cut off the communist forces. The North Korean forces will then quickly try to rush back into the north. Many will be captured and destroyed. Some, a group of them, of course, will continue to make it north. And so that leads us to the end of the second phase, which is by Christmas of 1950, the UN and the American troops had pushed the Chinese communist, or excuse me, the North Korean communists almost to the border of China, as you can see here. Now, one of the things that was a bit controversial was when the Americans passed the demarcation line into North Korea, which Truman did not specifically order, but MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur, purposely pushed across that line, and because of the success, Truman followed along with him. And there was a problem, however, and that was as the Americans and the UN forces pushed further north, the Chinese let them know that if they got too close to the Chinese border, the Chinese might attack. And so when we get to Christmas of 1950, once again the politicians are saying, and some of the even a military leader or two were saying that the war would be over by Christmas. We talked about that in class last time. But instead what happens is, just before Christmas in early December of 1950, millions of Chinese troops pour across the border and attack the American and UN forces who were not prepared for their attack, driving them all the way back almost to where the war began, in the demarcation line between North and South Korea. Now, the truth is that the communist forces actually made it south of Seoul in this attempt, the capital of South Korea, and then were pushed back again by the American forces and ended up along the line that you see here. A couple of controversial issues. When the Chinese attacked, the American commander Douglas MacArthur stated that if they want to attack Americans and do this, that the U.S. will consider using atomic weapons against the Chinese. Remember that we had created the atomic weapon, but we had yet to come up with the nuclear bomb, although that's coming, or the hydrogen bomb, and that's coming. But at this point, MacArthur continues to warn the Chinese that we would use atomic weapons if they didn't stop the attack. Now, Truman did not like this. Truman got very angry with MacArthur, told him to be quiet, but MacArthur would not be quiet about the potential of taking on all of China at this point as a result of their entry into this supposed police action. We'll talk more about that in a second. The way the war ends is that for the next 2 years, the two sides fight here along the what will be called the demilitarized zone. And really it kind of boils down to a World War I type war, because during those 2 years they will be in negotiations with the North Koreans, and the negotiations go very, very slowly and really aren't settled up until July of 1953, when the peace deal, as we might call it, which is truly still just an armistice, was signed. So technically the Korean War is not over yet. It has not been officially ended with a treaty, but instead the two sides keep massive numbers of troops facing each other, and it's one of the hot spots in the world. Now that North Korea is one of the few remaining communist nations, the chances that an incursion here would create World War III are much less likely. However, with North Korea attempting to get atomic or nuclear weapons, which could be the case actually, some theorists believe they have them. This is a hot spot that could create war even today. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention was that as MacArthur continued to talk about using atomic weapons against the Chinese and violating Truman's order to be quiet about it, Truman met with him in April of 1951 and actually fired MacArthur as the leader of the American troops. Now, in the minds of many Americans, MacArthur was a war hero who had taken the Philippines in World War II, had helped to run Japan and turn it into a nation that was now one of our allies, and finally had been behind the brilliant Incheon invasion and the success that the U.S. had had up to this point during the Korean War. So Truman's firing of MacArthur was something that was very unpopular. In fact, you can see his approval ratings here and how they continue to go downward. One of the things that added to that downward trend was his firing of the very popular MacArthur. An interesting note here is that historians look back on this as a major event in American political history, because the commander-in-chief had told the very popular general to stop doing something a general would not. He went ahead and fired the general, and yet was considered, the president was very unpopular. But in really what you could call a constitutional crisis, the president had continued with his powers of commander-in-chief and had proven that although our president is a civilian, his word is, or perhaps someday her word, are the last word when it comes to what the military will do. So the Constitution had been upheld, and the president is still looked at as the commander-in-chief. Okay, now we begin the career as president of Dwight Eisenhower, the great World War II hero who had been behind the invasion at D-Day and had commanded the Allied forces that moved across Western Europe into Germany. So again, following our usual stereotype or structure of the idea of if a general is successful, we want them to become president. Eisenhower will be the first general from World War II, and actually the only one, to become president of the United States. And he'll actually serve for 2 terms. By the way, Eisenhower was born in Denison, Texas. So let's talk a little bit about the overall economy in the post-war years. And as I think I mentioned in class the other day, this is a very successful time for our economy. Initially spurred by the release of pent-up wartime demand, it was amplified by the new technologies that came out of the war and new products as a result of it, also amplified by new worldwide markets. The United States, unlike after World War I, decides to go full force in selling products to the rest of the world, and it allows the United States economy to go even beyond what it had done during the 1920s. Transportation and communication accelerate this growth as we get the jet airplane and the interstate highway system that we'll be talking about. We have another consumer durables revolution with new products, and the other thing that's a big influence here are the baby boomers who begin to make their mark and have a huge impact on the culture, the morality, and the economy at every point within their lifetime. The election of 1952, Eisenhower will run against the Democrat Adlai Stevenson. Ike is very popular, but Republicans will hold only a small majority in both houses, which they will lose in the off-year elections of 1954. But Eisenhower will continue to be very popular during this time, and he's a very prototypical Republican president on the surface. He doesn't really seem to do too many things that are unusual or change a whole lot. He doesn't come in saying, let's crusade and change the world. He's going to be more of a caretaker president, and at the time, he was what the country really wanted. And in fact, they saw him as the leader of the success that they were having. You'll notice in the election of 1952 that the Solid South is still in existence, with a few states that go to the Republican, but the Solid South is still there, and we're going to see some changes in that coming up very soon. One historical note revolves around the vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, and this is going to be Richard Nixon. And it's interesting because Eisenhower and Nixon's relationship was never a very strong one. In fact, I don't think Eisenhower had much like or love for his vice president. But they put Nixon on the ticket for a lot of reasons. He was young at that time. He was from California, the new state that was growing dramatically. And he also was known as a cold warrior, which is something that the Republican Party liked very much and would also gain him some votes in the general public. We'll pick up with the details of this in the next episode.